This video is sponsored in part by Skillshare. When someone asks me, what's your favorite book, your favorite food, your favorite The Cure song, or I don't know, your favorite video game, or something like that, I pretty reliably freeze up, overwhelmed by the agony of choice, since it makes me feel like I have to pick my favorite child. There are always multiple things that immediately spring to mind, but they're often up there for very different reasons, and putting one above the others feels like saying those other ones are therefore lesser than. And that just feels wrong to me, like hurting them. What if I forget something that should be on there? God forbid. Ironically though, Fatal Frame is a curious exception to this. It's a series I've already dedicated 2 heartfelt videos to in the past, one of them even boldly proclaiming how Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly comes as close as it gets to perfection in a horror game. A claim I still 100% stand behind, by the way. But strangely enough, when it comes to this very series, I don't even have to think for a second to know that it is, in fact, the third entry, Fatal Frame 3 The Tormented, that undisputedly earns the accolade of being my favorite entry in the series for me. At the end of my video on Fatal Frame 2, I had already teased how Fatal Frame 3 was my secret favorite in the series. But to be honest, that statement was based on decade-old memories from back when I had played them for the first time, where I felt the margin between them was rather, marginal. But now, over a decade later, when finally revisiting the third, I was gobsmacked by how much wider that gap had grown by my newfound impressions of it. So much so that I can declare without a sliver of a doubt that, yes, The Tormented is to me by far the strongest entry in an already peerless series of survival horror games. Fatal Frame 3 is secretly genius because it manages to surpass its predecessors without ever attempting to outshine or push them down under itself, but quite the opposite. It manages to retroactively pull its older sisters along with it, enhance them posthumously, and even turn both the first and second entry into a more coherent, holistic, and rewarding experience. A feat that only the rarest kind of video game gem ever manages to achieve. This final episode of my long-spanning Fatal Frame Trilogy revisit will be my personal logbook, and on this journey, you will be the Diane to my Agent Cooper as I explore, explain, and hopefully unravel what exactly it is that makes Rei Amakura's dark journey into the Manor of Sleep my uncontested pinnacle of the Fatal Frame series. Alright, before we go on, I'd like to express my thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring the making of this video. So, in return, let me show you what they've got to offer to you. Skillshare is an online learning community curated specifically for convenient and efficient learning, with thousands of classes on topics like video editing, audio recording, graphic design, 3D modeling and animation, game development, writing, and a lot more. I've been using Skillshare for my own use for quite a while for many different things actually, like you might have seen me use this effect here in some of my videos in the past. It's called 2.5D or parallax animations, where you take a photo and make it appear three-dimensional and alive with layered movement and animation. One of the best resources to really properly explain, teach, and cement the use of this technique is the class Bringing a Photo to Life with 2.5D Parallax by Joe Fellows, founder and director of the motion graphics, visual effects, and video production company Make Productions. It's a really well-structured, straightforward, and efficient class that gets you to create stunning visual effects like these with just some basic Photoshop and After Effects knowledge. Or in my case, I'm just doing it in Premiere instead. Getting Skillshare Premium costs less than $10 if billed annually, and if you're curious, the first 1,000 people to follow the link in my description will get an instant free trial of Skillshare Premium without forced subscription or disclosure of any payment information. Go check it out. Thanks a lot again, and now I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Rei Amakura is not in a good place in her life. Several months ago, the 23-year-old freelance photographer had lost her fiancé Yu in a car accident one rainy night, when she was driving. Plagued by soul-crushing guilt, depression, and sleepless nights, Rei tries to drown her sorrows in hard work. She, together with her assistant Miku, is working on a documentary photo series that captures abandoned places across Japan that are rumored to be haunted. Most of these places are just that, rumors. But we, the audience and hard-boiled veterans of the Fatal Frame series, know that this narrative universe has more to offer than just some atmospheric, forlorn places that stimulate the imagination. One day, when exploring one such supposedly haunted place, Rei suddenly finds after-images of her late fiancé in the viewfinder of her camera. Startled and confused, she attempts to pursue his spectral apparition deeper into the abandoned house. Like in a waking dream, Rei finds herself from one moment to the next standing in a completely different place. Colors faded, snowflakes gently falling, a courtyard of an age-old estate, candles dimly illuminating an age-worn diorama of gravestones. The place emanates an uneasy calmness that you can feel. This is when we take control of Rei for the first time. At first glance, if you're coming straight from the previous games or from most other survival horror games of the PS2 era, everything feels extremely familiar. The controller options support the same layout schemes as in Fatal Frame 2. We move our protagonist relative to fixed position wide camera angles, or, if we prefer, we can change it to traditional tank controls in the options. Objects of interest can be inspected or interacted with via simple button press, and at any given time, Rei can pull out her camera and enter Fatal Frame's signature investigation and combat mode, where we can peek through the seeker lens with camera obscura to discover and capture ghostly apparitions on celluloid. But as much as the controls feel familiar, once I started following the beckoning spectral image of you deeper into the corridors of the manor, I felt a bit confused, to be honest, when I noticed one long-time default feature of the previous titles had been seemingly removed. In the predecessors, whenever you would spot a ghostly apparition and hit the camera button, your character would automatically snap their view into the exact direction of it and focus the viewfinder straight up on them. All you had to do was press the trigger to take the picture. It pretty quickly turns into an intuitive pull-out, shoot reflex, which was certainly convenient, but it also put your mind on autopilot because it didn't really force you to be fully aware of the three-dimensional space your character was in at all times. Fatal Frame 3 drops this mechanic. At first. When you want to snap a ghost in good old series tradition for the first time, you'll realize that, oh, wait, what, I have to manually? Whoa. It feels intuitively worse at first, because it is less comfortable, less convenient. But the question is really, is this a bad thing in a horror game? My personal answer to that has always been, not necessarily. If the removal of convenience is done on purpose, it can be a powerful tool. In Fatal Frame 3, this feature, the automatic targeting of ghosts in the vicinity, has been turned into an active ability that you can unlock later in the game and activate or deactivate at will. The interesting thing about this is that this little example of a mechanical change foreshadows one of the central themes of the entire game: discomfort where you expect comfort to be. We'll get to that later in more depth, but the gist is that the designers make extremely deliberate use of the omission of comfort in order to enhance the effectiveness of its mechanics on the game's feel, its message, and the horror. So we follow you deeper into the mansion, drawn by an allure that Rei can't place just yet, and whose unraveling is going to be at the center of her quest. But just before she can reach him as she walks away into an old shrine house, she's interrupted by a feverish vision. A mysterious, spectral woman, covered head to toe in tattoos, stalks her, grips her, and suddenly, Rei finds herself tied to an altar slab, where young shrine maidens drive nails through her hands and feet while a sinister patchwork of tattoos violently spreads across her body. What first appears like a simple hallucination or daydream quickly turns out to be the start of an ancient curse Rei was exposed to due to the sorrow and guilt she's been carrying with her. She returns home, haunted by restless nights, and eventually discovers that what she saw was not just a figment of her imagination. From that point on, whenever she falls asleep, Rei finds herself transported back into the manor of sleep, living on in a parallel world of nightmares that are innately connected to the waking life. Pictures she takes with the iconic camera obscura in the dreams miraculously appear within the real-life antique camera obscura she found in her late partner's room. And the more she learns about the mansion's lore and mysteries, and the more she attempts to fight the curse, the more the same tattoo she had seen in that vision before, slowly but inexorably spreads across her body when she's awake. So, since there's literally no way to escape the haunted nightmare estate, since we all gotta sleep eventually, Rei braces herself and takes up the fight against this ancient curse with the best and only weapon we have to combat the uncanny powers of mysticism and folklore: knowledge. Folklore has always been one of the most front and center elements that have made the Fatal Frame games unique in how they present and explore their narrative, both when it comes to the story and setting of the games, as well as the role of the player therein. The central thesis of my first video in this little mini-series was indeed how Fatal Frame brilliantly incorporates folklore into writing, design, scripting, and the gameplay itself as a vessel for horror, an aspect that the second entry in the series drastically expanded upon. But if we're completely honest, there was always a little bit of a gap, a certain ludonarrative disconnect between the role of the game's protagonist and the one of the player themselves. In both Fatal Frame 1 and 2, you take control of a protagonist who is stuck in a singular, uninterrupted event throughout which she must uncover forgotten knowledge around the folkloric perils she encounters, while the player gets the scattered beats and snippets of information siphoned uncommented on their screen, having to piece together story and lore in their own mind. It is silently assumed that the player's state of knowledge, including the conclusions they draw at all times, sort of overlap with that of the protagonist, but the situations couldn't be more varied, could they? Fatal Frame is a series that deputizes the player to amateur anthropologists. It's a central part of the appeal of its archaeological style of storytelling. Fatal Frame 3 takes this aspect of the series' concept to a whole new level and tries to completely shatter the gap between players and protagonist. Because deciphering and interpreting long-forgotten folklore through ancient texts and artifacts is a long and arduous process that requires tedious research and a broad set of skills, sources, and first and foremost, patience. And that is precisely what Rei Amakura's vocation as a freelance photographer focuses on. The game's story, in contrast to its predecessors, takes place over the course of multiple weeks, and a vital part plays out in Rei's very home, the place where she lives, sleeps, develops her photographs in her darkroom, and actively researches the folkloric origins of her subjects by resorting to a range of different resources she has at her disposal. When we take photos of important objects, apparitions, or points of interest in the dream world, we find those photos as undeveloped film in our camera back in the waking world. We can then develop the pictures in Rei's darkroom, then go on to do research on those photos directly by, for instance, searching her fiancé's bookshelf filled with papers and works on various folkloric topics, or we find matching exhibits in his collection of artifacts. Or we listen to audio recordings on the tape recorder in her room. We accompany Rei, the protagonist herself, in the process of researching to uncover the mystery, including things she doesn't know or comprehend yet. Every time we obtain new information, Rei actively writes into her extensive and well-sorted journal, where she keeps track of people, places, stories, and other information. Our state of knowledge, when playing the game for the first time of course, is identical to Rei's at any given time, and the things she says and writes down reflect that. Learning the folkloric background behind events, places, and people we encounter in the dream world through Rei, bit by bit, piece by piece, makes the player feel far more in sync with the protagonist's thought process, and getting the information drip-fed feels far less like video gamey exposition dump, but more like both Rei and the player go through the same process of gradual discovery together. At the same time, Fatal Frame doubles down on the narrative weight of the camera obscura. In previous games, it was already a central element that embodied the symbolic efficacy of the empiric over the powers of make-believe and folklore. Capturing a ghost on celluloid and proving its existence, documenting it for posterity is what literally saps its life force.
Yes, science!
But in Fatal Frame 3, it takes the camera obscura's role another step further, because the pictures you take are no longer just a byproduct, useless collectibles that reduce the camera itself to a metaphor ghost cannon, but since you record and then process the information later at home, with the players actively developing the film in the darkroom, which is a really cool feature if I might say so, it makes the iconic camera finally an integral part of the folklorist element of the games. It's genius, now on even another level. It is well known that many hands make light work, and that is just as true for folklore as for anything else. And luckily, Rei is a firm believer of this maxim. She's working together with her assistant and photography student Miku, who conveniently lives together with her as her roommate in her house. And she doesn't just assist Rei with lighting and setup on her outdoor photo shoots, she's also exceedingly helpful when it comes to research. Whenever we develop a picture that contains something of interest for our studies, we can ask Miku to do some external research on her own, and she'll get back to us sometime later with all the info she can scrape together. And yes, serious veterans know this roommate of ours is none other than Miku Hinasaki, protagonist of the first game and survivor of the Himuro Mansion incident, which was the catalyst for her to move in with Rei and take interest in photography and folklore studies in the first place. Rei's fiancé Yu happened to be a close friend of Miku's brother Mafuyu, who went missing during the events of the first game. After the Himuro Mansion incident, Yu took Miku in after Mafuyu's disappearance, and they lived together in Rei's house from that point on. At the same time, Rei regularly receives investigation notes in the mail from Kei Amakura, another close friend of her late fiancé who's not yet aware of Yu's death. Kei happens to be looking into a similarly strange curse that has befallen his niece, who turns out to be none other than Miu Amakura, protagonist of Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly. Kei regularly sends us updates on his findings which turn out to overlap and thereby actively contribute to our own research, and later in the game he even joins us in the house and becomes an active part of the team. It's a vivid process of multiple people actively working on uncovering the same mystery together over a long stretch of time by giving their unique perspective and cross-referencing their respective pool of information with each other. It feels believable. Now, this next part is where some people might feel inclined to disagree on a personal level, because it might seem like this is more of an opinion than an objective analysis, but my point here is really more structural to how the game is written than subjective. Because Rei is, in many ways, a far better written protagonist than any of the previous main characters. That doesn't mean that you can't like the other characters more individually, but Fatal Frame 3 goes a long way to really create a believable, relatable character with an actual personality profile, backstory, quirks, dreams, fears, habits, mannerisms that make her feel like a real human being. And that in turn makes her motives that much more grounded in and relevant to the story she's central to. Now, I'm not saying that a long winding backstory always makes a character deeper or better. Just think about how much personality Samus Aran from the first Metroid games conveyed through purely incidental and organic storytelling versus how flat she felt with hundreds of lines of soliloquy droning on about a barely related backstory in Other M.
I knew it to be true, but still couldn't help looking at my palm for a sign.
But in many ways, if we're completely honest, the previous protagonists within the respective games themselves were relatively generic shells. Miku was a schoolgirl whose brother went missing, so she went to Himuro Mansion in search for him. Miu was a schoolgirl whose sister went missing in the rural Japanese Minakami village, so she went in search for her. And sure, their characterizations grow across each game through their actions, their attachments, fears, and the experiences they make during their respective ordeals, no question. But their stories don't really encourage to become the subject of deep character studies like pretty much every Silent Hill or Rule of Rose character has received over the years, because there really isn't that much to explore. I don't know, I might be a bit biased though, because Rei is also the protagonist that I personally relate the most to, so take my opinions with a pinch of salt. Always do that, actually, no matter what. But for starters, for the first time, our protagonist is not in high school anymore, but a fully grown adult professional woman. She has devoted years of her life to studying her passion, photography, and turn it into a career. Relatable. She has also, and as it's insinuated, always had, the tendency to overwork herself and often uses her work as a coping mechanism and escapism for difficulties in her private life. A character trait that was strongly amplified by her recent traumatic loss, which pushed her into deep post-traumatic depression. Her attempt to suffocate her depression with endless work, in turn, resulted in severe sleep issues. Relatable. Especially since we don't just experience Rei within the Dream Manor, the place where discovery and fighting takes place, but also accompany her in her private space where she lives her everyday life. Her character is given so much more breathing room compared to previous games. We can deduce a plethora of details about her as a person from environmental storytelling, for instance. She's shown to like and dislike things. Wow. She has stuff she's fascinated by and that she hyper-focuses on? Super relatable. Her apartment alone is a mirror that tells us so much more about her as a person than we were allowed to discover about any of the previous protagonists across the length of their respective games. And to top it all off, she and Miku have a cat, and you can even pet it. And because she is a far more fleshed out character, this is incredibly conducive to the story and the horror game experience, because her motives are complex, clear, and understandable. At the center of the story is a curse that revolves around people stricken with very similar troubles to her. Post-traumatic stress disorder caused by the loss of a loved one and a deep sense of survivor's guilt. Rei herself is tormented by this due to the car crash that she feels guilty for, not just for having caused it, but she's torn by the remorse over having survived while her partner lost his life in it. This motivation, while learning how other tormented souls in the Manor of Sleep suffer from similar experiences of loss and guilt, makes exploring and learning more about this lucid purgatory while trying to find a way to aid those similarly afflicted to Rei so much more engaging and motivating. If the previous games had one major downside, it was exactly this aspect, that its protagonist felt comparably interchangeable for the stories they were central to. Rei Amakura is the antithesis of this. The story of Fatal Frame 3 is the story of her own internal strife, which makes her the seminal thread in a deeply interwoven network of victims who find themselves trapped in this sinister curse and whose only hope is that Rei takes up their suffering and makes it part of her own. That might sound like it was a little harsh on Miku and Miu here, but let me say that this is really something that I've only started realizing once I played the third game and felt the impact a more deeply fleshed out protagonist in a purposeful meta gameplay can have on my investment into a game's story. But this is where one of Fatal Frame 3's most brilliant aspect comes into play. In my previous video, I mentioned how Fatal Frame 2 is a standalone story in the same mythologic universe that takes place before the events and has only a few relatively obscure direct links to the first game. It works completely on its own. But instead of doing its own thing again, Fatal Frame 3 takes both of its siblings by the hand and unites them into a trinity that makes each entry better than it is alone on its own two proverbial feet. And it does that by neither retconning, overriding, retroactively trying to improve anything destructively, nor by introducing new elements that contradict the first two games. They still stand on their own. The keys to this are, yes, the mythological universe these stories now more firmly share, but more importantly, the emotional long-term effect the incidents in the first two games have on the characters involved. Because Fatal Frame 3, as I mentioned before, brings back the people from the previous games and makes them a central part of its own narrative, most prominently the first game's protagonist, Miku, but here, these characters are given equally more space to breathe and develop greater depth, room to flourish as a person. In Fatal Frame 3, Miku lives together with Rei, and we are now, for the first time, given the chance to experience her everyday life and family situation as well, and just like with Rei, discover stuff like her caring and supportive nature, especially around Rei in the aftermath of her personal loss. And we also get to paint a picture of her personality through how she lives, how she decorates her room, how she cares for the cat, things she collects that matter to her, that she finds pretty or cute, and so on. Environmental character building. And none of these clash with or contradict the comparably trivial character depicted in Fatal Frame 1, but these new added layers of personality serve to enhance Miku within the setting. So much so that replaying the first game afterwards gives you a satisfying feeling of greater familiarity with the character as a series veteran. That is especially the case because Miku also ends up being heavily involved in the tattooed curse of the Manor of Sleep. She is likewise trying to process and come to terms with the loss of a loved one, and we get to witness the effect this has on her firsthand in Fatal Frame 3. Because ultimately that is what the tattooed curse is all about. It feasts on vulnerable people who have experienced painful loss and ensnares them in the grips of the nightmare state. And Rei happens to be at the center of it all, taking on the role of the bound one who takes up the tormented's fears and anxieties within herself. This interconnection of fates leads to the game's wonderful twist that in certain chapters, when Rei goes to sleep and finds herself transported into the Manor of Sleep, she enters the haunted place in the shoes of none other than Miku herself. It was a wonderful surprise for me when I encountered it for the first time, I gotta say. The sequence introducing her first segment is a wonderful throwback to the opening shot of the first Fatal Frame. And this inclusion of other people's mental landscape makes the entire setting feel so much more surreal and otherworldly, especially if you have played the first two Fatal Frame games. This purgatorial scenario is molded from the innermost sorrows of a host of people, which is represented in the very structure of the building. A collection of the places associated with traumatic memories of different people amalgamated into a singular, grotesque architectural construct. We play the first few chapters as Rei and gradually explore and uncover more corridors, courtyards, and rooms of the haunted estate, Metroidvania style, until we eventually rediscover the same place through the eyes of other people and find parts of the architecture that represent the very rooms we still remember from Himura Mansion itself, the setting from the first game, but seamlessly integrated into the structure of the manor. There's something seriously uncanny and wrong about how this feels, and I want to say this is a tremendously cool effect that only works quite like this if you've played the first game and have become intimately familiar with its layout and most iconic places across the duration of the game, and then suddenly find them within a place where they just shouldn't be. But it's also not a complete replica of Himura Mansion. It's only a partial mirror, conflated and condensed, like someone's memory who only remembered the most striking landmarks but left the biggest impression on their long-term recollection of it. It is how dreams and memories work. And it is not just Miku, but we also get to embody another character who himself struggles in his own way with the loss of a loved one brought about by the events of previous games. The second deuteragonist, Kei, uncle of Fatal Frame 2's Miu, who's been fervently researching the strange curse that has befallen his niece after her ordeal in Minakami Village. His segments too give access to directly interlinked segments of the Manor of Sleep that seamlessly integrate into the location, but there are also clearly places from Fatal Frame 2's various houses. There are segments of the Kurosawa house, the Osaka house, and even the cell that Mayu was locked in during the fourth chapter. Only that this time it's the spectral recollection of Miu, who's trapped, and Kei the one searching for the keys, trying to free her from captivity. And the beauty of it is the way in which these places tie into each other, which makes you wonder just how many different jigsaw pieces the mansion is truly assembled from. Because Miku and Kei, and by extension Miu as well, are only a few of a good many of other tormented souls whose sorrows and memories form the foundation of the Manor of Sleep and its tattooed curves. On top of that, playing 3 different characters in a lucid, hot seat during select chapters of the game isn't just a neat gimmick. It also comes with some really enjoyable gameplay twists. All of the previous titles were, typical for survival horror, Metroidvania structured. The first game exclusively took place in a single location, a large traditional Japanese estate whose corridors and chambers gradually open up new wings and segments to the player, like when you get the right key, the right piece of information, solved a puzzle, or acquired other things that would unlock previously closed off spaces. And then regularly you'd unlock a shortcut closing back to the main loop. Fatal Frame 2 expanded this approach to a grander scale by playing out across an entire village, with multiple self-contained locations that were pretty much individual mini-Metroidvania stages in between. Fatal Frame 3, The Tormented, returns to a single, self-contained location again, the convoluted and maze-like Manor of Sleep, but it is one that stays largely interesting and versatile by incorporating many different locations and buildings and architectural styles into its structure, often in a way that doesn't make sense, a somnambulistic, non-Euclidean labyrinth. With the twist that each character doesn't just play slightly differently, like Kay for instance introduces stealth passages where you encounter ghosts you can't fight back but have to actually hide from, and the respective characters' cameras have different functions, strengths and weaknesses, and you level them individually. But each of the playable characters also can enter spaces that others can't. Like Kay, for instance, is physically stronger than the other two and can move furniture that's blocking off doors and corridors around. And once you've done that, these roadblocks stay out of the way for other characters too. Or Miku is a bit more petite, so she can crouch into smaller spaces. And let me just say, some of these crouch spaces have some of the nastiest ghost encounters in the entire series waiting for the player. In my personal experience, this was really the Fatal Frame with the most absolutely cleverly pulled off scares that really caught me by surprise and made me jump, all emerging from gameplay and not cheaply scripted in a sequence, which is quite the feat for someone who's usually extremely stoic at any attempt to startle me in games and films. The combat in Fatal Frame 3 is just as perfectly orchestrated as in previous games, and clearly stands on the shoulders of the second game's achievements. The camera obscura that you customize with rare but strong film and various additional features, like for instance pushing back ghosts upon flash or slowing down your enemy's movement so you can more easily get that perfect shuttered chance shot for maximum damage. The eponymous Fatal Frame. It's the iconically unique and enjoyable combat style the series is known for. But even though the fights are just as well, if not even a tad better designed and engaging as in the universally beloved Crimson Butterfly, and even though the game does its best to spice up the formula with interesting little twists in enemy design even more so than its predecessor, it is the 3 different playable characters who ultimately save it from becoming too monotonous over time, but they bring a genuinely refreshing twist to the formula that keep the gameplay diverse and help break up the perpetual cycle of recurrently revisiting the same location over and over again. But yeah, just like Miku, who was more of a passive observer in the first game, has been given more space to grow as an actual character, in the same way Kay's struggle in helping his niece to overcome the curse, as well as the plethora of deeper folkloric background his work provides, gives Fatal Frame 2's story more background and depth in hindsight. And this in turn makes replaying the second game equally more enjoyable once you know so much more about the protagonist and her personal background. Fatal Frame 3 genuinely made me want to pick up the first 2 games again after getting through the trilogy, and it was great. It's really something I didn't expect from myself as someone who constantly struggles to find even enough time to play games just for myself. I thought it would take me years until I got around to revisiting after having just played them, but Fatal Frame 3 added so much to the Trinity as a completed piece that it almost felt like discovering them with completely new eyes. And that is one of the rarest masterstrokes a game or a sequel can achieve. And a big part of this character-centered approach in doing that also makes a lot of sense for what Fatal Frame 3 is trying to achieve, because in the entire series, The Tormented is by far and away the most clear-cut psychological horror Fatal Frame there is. Fatal Frame 3 adds deeply personal elements to the established formula. Of course, previous stories had always a personal stake for the protagonists, rescuing family members from peril and such, but as we've established before, in Fatal Frame 3 we don't just play out the immediate events surrounding the disappearance of a loved one, we deal with the psychological aftermath of losing one. Rei's fiancé has already passed away, and his spectre in the Manor of Sleep is a manifestation of her personal grief and the guilt and despair she feels over it and that she cannot bring herself to absolve herself from. And the house itself is an id machine for that, a landscape woven from painful memories, fears, anxieties, and trauma of many people who suffer from similar loss of a loved one and the resulting sense of survivor's guilt, the leitmotif of the curse. In a way, the manor comes far closer to a surreal nightmare landscape like the town of Silent Hill, which manifests the trapped victim's innermost demons into literal, fierce adversaries that haunt and torment them while they try to work through their regrets. This place is their very own personal purgatory, a cruel but cleansing place that directs them towards self-realization and eventually, hopefully, redemption. Similar to Silent Hill 2, for instance, it's a patchwork woven from multiple people's subconsciousnesses, since the Manor of Sleep combines elements close and personal to Rei's very own story, but morphs them together with elements through which he enters the personal hell of other people. Hell is other people. One aspect I talked about in the previous chapter is how Fatal Frame 3 uses different playable characters to break up monotony, and this is also a bigger theme the game consciously embraces. Rei's home is a place that, very similar to how it functions in Silent Hill 4 The Room, serves as a central hub and place of refuge between the bouts of exploring the isekai, the other world. In both games, Rei's house and respectively Henry's apartment are places that you regularly return to and where you can feel relieved for a moment from the constant tension, a safe haven where players can rest and recuperate from the dangers of the nightmare world out there. I love this element because it allows for a change in pacing that diversifies the gameplay of the mansion sections. In Rei's home, it mostly revolves around routine and feels more like doing classic adventure tasks. Talk with Miku, receive a phone call, develop photos, explore, read up on stuff, pet the cat, do some research. These segments establish a difference in kind that makes returning to the mansion after a short break feel more engaging again. Because when you highlight everything in a text, you highlight nothing. And that's the same with survival horror gameplay. Sometimes it's good to take a breather once in a while. It helps the action segments stand out more within the tension graph. Classic survival horror games often have a quite limited range of difference in kind. Explore, fight, inventory management, puzzle solving, which can get stale after a good while of reiterating the same rotation over and over again. So where previous entries in the series had you perpetually under peril, like if you strolled around for too long, you'd eventually get attacked by random encounter ghosts, meaning you really never had a moment to let your guard down. In Fatal Frame 3, these segments of home make the fight more bearable and generally work towards a more diverse play experience. Giving both players and the protagonist a place to return to, a haven and emotional anchor, is an incredibly effective method to establish a sense of belonging. I bet there are a great many people having incredibly fond associations with the music that's playing right now, and that doesn't just come from the track by Matt Ullman being an excellent piece of music, but it has to do with the associations formed over many hours of playtime in which this guitar arrangement was gradually conditioned to become associated with the emotion of returning to relative safety.
Hello, my friend. Stay a while and listen.
But, and this is something I always admired in games, I also mentioned earlier that Fatal Frame 3 makes the deliberate omission or withdrawal of comfort a recurring design theme, and the house is one of the most striking examples for that. Because, very similar to Silent Hill 4, over time, this carefully established sanctity and safety of Rei's home becomes gradually invaded from the nightmare realm. At first it is sounds, glitches, foreign sensations that are out of place. Something's not right. A pair of feet behind the curtain that disappear the moment you look closer, footsteps heard in a part of the house where there shouldn't be anyone. But then gradually these happenings become stronger and more threatening, and it gets clear that the dream manor is bleeding into reality, and that makes Rei's ordeal all the more perilous. Not only can she not escape the horrors when she's asleep, but now it even follows her into her own home, sullying the taken-for-granted comfort of her own four walls to truly torment her every step of the way. Convenience is the fear killer. Horror, by definition, is the opposite of having a fun and lighthearted time. And this invasion of privacy and sanctity is an excellent means of interactive storytelling only possible like this in video games, to make players feel the perpetual anxiety Rei herself is experiencing. Through that, Fatal Frame 3 manages a damn near perfect blend of folklore and psychological horror wrapped in a tried and true, honed PS2 survival horror package. And hey, the inclusion of a modern Japanese single-family home as a recurring setting makes Fatal Frame 3, the third entry in a series that already boldly wore its inspirations on its sleeve, even more feel like playing a bona fide early 2000s J-horror movie. Fatal Frame 3 The Tormented is yet another example of a piece of video game history that gets increasingly hard to preserve. If you want to obtain an original PS2 version, you gotta expect to find used copies among the more pricey collector sales. It's not quite in the regions of a Kuon or Rule of Rose just yet, but it certainly doesn't make it easy to get access to the game in the legal way. The only digital option at the moment of release of this video is a re-release within the PS2 Classics lineup in the PlayStation 3 online store. No further releases came after that, and I'm not incredibly optimistic it's gonna happen anytime soon, because with the Fatal Frame entries that came out after the third for Wii, 3DS, and Wii U gradually dropping in acclaim and popularity, and Nintendo, who by now owns the complete publishing rights and has all the say over what does and doesn't happen with it, doesn't appear all that interested in engaging with Fatal Frame anymore, despite producer Keisuke Kichuki repeatedly stating that many members of the old team would be eager and willing to revive the series any day. And even if the Fatal Frame series gets picked up and revived again, you can usually expect it to be primarily centered around its far more prominent second entry, Crimson Butterfly. So as with many abandoned classics, emulation does a lot of heavy lifting for the heavily neglected preservation of this game. If you're interested in emulating it yourself, the footage in this video was recorded with a PCSX2 emulator, and I've provided a link in the description to a Google Doc with instructions on how to set it up to make it run neatly. But this lack of availability and publisher interest renders Fatal Frame 3 a seriously overlooked and underrated jewel, and in many ways it is the most interesting entry in one of the most seminal survival horror series in history that never really got the credit it deserved. Fatal Frame 3 remains my favorite because it is a game that dares to change the formula with things off the safe path. And that is something I've always highly respected, more so than the aspiration for perfectly polished mechanics and systems. Aside from that it resonates much stronger with me personally through the character of Rei, I also love the game for going the bold path of actively omitting comfort to create tension with game systems. It is something that a lot of people intuitively loathe and think of as a bad thing, but that I've personally always held in extremely high regards. It is the potentially more rewarding path of higher resistance from a game design perspective, and the result is a story that I intrinsically care deeper about as a player because I feel more strongly immersed in the story and its systems. I feel more like I'm an active part of its narrative than just a generic schoolgirl. And most of all, I love this game because it makes me appreciate its predecessors even more than I did before. Fatal Frame 3 embraces and cherishes what made the series so special in the first place, and combines the three of them into an inseparable, unholy trinity of survival horror games. And here we are. Thank you so much for watching. We've now gotten pretty much exactly a year after I released the first one to the end of my video essay crusade through the classic PS2 Fatal Frame trilogy. This doesn't mean it's going to be the last thing I do on Fatal Frame. I have some more things potentially in mind, but none of it is like written in stone at this point. So let me know how you feel about branching out on the series in the future. A big reason why it took me an entire year is that each of these videos took a long time to make, start to finish, from the initial idea, over replaying, intensive recording, note-taking, writing, copy editing. Over the whole production process, each video was developed over the course of multiple months until the final result. That's how my channel as a one-man operation has been working for a long time, and why the one upload per month schedule was the most I could manage while working full-time on it. But thanks to your loyalty and the generous support of my patrons, I firmly plan to increase this rhythm this year, and after I've taken some time off resting after a year of hard work in 2020, plus some necessary red tape and a lot of preparation work in January, the first taste of my new increased output I intend to share with you this month already. After this video today, the next release covering the freezing cold Ukrainian survival horror shooter Cryostasis is scheduled for just a week after this video comes out. And because I'm now finally able to work together with more talent on the regular, I'm firmly aiming to release a good deal more videos in 2021 compared to the years past. I'm excited for this year, really am. And this wouldn't be possible without the undying support of you, my viewers, and as I mentioned, the financial crowdfunding support of those who pitch in on Patreon. If you'd like to join the community and support my work as well, then please follow this link and contribute for a monthly donation within your personal comfort levels. It really makes all the difference in the world. Thank you so much for considering. My special gratitude, thank you for your immortal support shoutout this time goes out to these wonderful people. Thank you to Ian Rhodes, Swallowtail Knights, Kevin H. Yang, Sophie Powelson, Chris Chan, Shannon Blue, Kelly Michelle Russell, Corey Marr, Andrew Hines, Chuck Taylor, Lex Reckless, 9ball9606, Alex Popov, Dr. Haley Isabella Colley, Norbert Gerard Matinka, Jin Hansen, Matt Gretton, Starina Abramson, David Zelenak, Hunter Crawford and Margaret Strawn, Max Macula, Pablo Arcelus, Laird Wakala, Terry Collins, Puka Princess, Malum, Agustin Ortega, Thwagam, Raul Blanco, Nikon the Brave, Wobbles and Bean the Wonder Ducks, Canton Podon, David Southpaw, Catherine Escobar, Chris Z, Lawrence E. Buben, Ty McCandless, Refkins, Cordelia Crescendo, Casper Ram, Billy Lott, Christine, Kenan Ward, Isabella Stoner, Faulty Gear, Boris Bugling, Federico Rocha, Giselle Almonte, Dana Rosa, Ronan Crom aka Daniel 242172, and Wong Vu. Until next time, ta-ta.